Obviously, people have criticised the situation for Warren Tucker's found himself in a position of being politicised by the process. Are you concerned at all how that's happened?
Well, I think it's unfortunate. I mean, all I can say is I've dealt with Warren Tucker for 5 years, both as Leader of the Opposition and as Prime Minister. In that time I found him to be meticulous, and I found him to be very thorough in what he does, and takes notes and says he briefs someone.
In the House last week, you were goading Phil Goff and saying that he had been briefed when clearly at that stage there was no information that he had been briefed. The OIA...
Well, I had information at that time he'd been briefed.
So you had information that he'd been briefed?
Sure. I made that clear when I was in the United States. I made it when I was on Agenda, which was on the week prior to being
so isn't that a breach of the convention of...
It's the Minister's responsibility to inform me under no surprises.
Well, except that in this particular case, you go to the Minister, you go to the Phil Goff, you put Warren Tucker in a position where he felt he had no choice but to release under the Official Information Act.
No, that's not
the
right.
Document.
What happened was Mr. Goff made a statement that he wasn't briefed. I asked the SIS, was that the case? Was that seems unlikely? Because they have a responsibility to keep briefed. The Leader of the Opposition, he said, or in fact as it turned out initially, number 2 said the records show he was briefed. I then followed up the next day and checked with the Director. He said he was absolutely briefed. He was happy for me to make that statement public, and he was happy that he had the paperwork to prove that was the case.
But in doing that, didn't you drag the Director of the SIS directly into the political sphere and putting him in a position?
Saying he wasn't briefed.
Well, I mean, Phil Goff maintains that he wasn't briefed even now.
There was a document with that annotation on it saying he'd been briefed.
Well, Warren Tucker told me that he had documentation to show that he briefed him.
And did anyone in your office or yourself convey that to Cameron Slater?
No, not to the best of my knowledge.
Not to the best of your knowledge. I mean, is there going to be an inquiry to find out whether there was the leak of a top secret document to a blogger?
Well, there isn't a leak. I mean, the situation is quite clear. That Cameron Slater went to the SIS and under the Official Information Act asked for the release of that document. What happened was Warren Tucker didn't come to me for that. He went to his legal advisors, and the legal advisors told him this is the process they have to follow. And when he was going through that process, it was that point he told me he'd release him because he has to tell me that under no surprises policy.
So who were those legal advisors?
Asked for a document that no one else knew existed. Does that not concern you?
No, I mean, I had publicly said that there was a document. I'm pretty sure from memory.
But they didn't supply it to anyone else. Who was this legal advisor?
No one else asked for it.
Yes, they did ask for it. I mean, both the Fairfax, we asked for it on the 29th. I mean, I think Fairfax asked for it on the 27th.
Well, you need to go through the...
We still haven't been supplied with it.
No, you need to take that up with Warren Tucker. I'm not
well, I mean, selective supply of top secret information under the Official Information Act is kind of unusual.
It's not selective. It's subject to the legal opinion given by
who?
By the lawyers to Warren Tucker.
The lawyers to Warren Tucker being whom?
Well, SIS's lawyers.
Mr. Goff,
well, who have you cited that legal opinion?
I think we've dealt with that issue.
Well, no, because it's very.
I'll always answer your questions respectfully.
It's a very novel.
Not a continuous 500 questions.
It's a very novel situation, though.
Mr. Goff has suggested that. Sorry, it's Thomas.
Sure. No.
That Cameron Slater seems to have been. Someone suggested to him the right question to ask to get the right document. Now, did anybody in your office point to him the right question to ask?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
Does that mean you don't know for sure?
Well, I've got no reason to believe he was given any information.
Has the SIS now created a precedent where we can find out subjects that Leader of the Opposition or you have been briefed on when we haven't been able to in the past?
Well, no, I mean, I guess it would depend on whatever questions you ask. I mean, of course, you've got to remember what was released wasn't all of the information in there. It was, I've seen documents that were released like you have, and that was simply the headlines. But I'm sure if you ask those questions under the Official Information Act, you'll receive similar type of correspondence.
Standard and Poor's. Did the SIS at any time discuss with you or any of your representatives the timing of it, the speed in which it should be released, or were you consulted about that?
No.
So that was all the SIS's legal advice, not their own decision, whether it should be rushed out.
So, I mean, to get back to this legal advice, have you seen it? I mean, it seems novel I mean, we all make Official Information Act requests all the time.
I'm not sure if you understand it.
There's no legal basis that we as journalists understand that there is any reason to urgently release top secret information under the Official Information Act.
Okay, I'm not sure if you understand the way a government department works, but they have responsibility. I'm the minister. The chief executive has responsibility, and it's the chief executive's department that was asked for that information under the Official Information Act. They took legal advice about the release of that.
Is New Zealand still looking or thinking of honouring her in any way? There's been repeated calls for that over the years. I think Judith Collins was a staunch group of that idea, but nothing's happened.
No, it's not possible to do it posthumously. And at the time when we became the government, and I chaired APH, I sought some advice on whether it was possible to give Nancy Wake an honour, and the advice was it wasn't. So I can read you that advice if you want, which says, Miss Wake's service and heroism during World War II was recognised with decorations from those countries whose armed services she served with or alongside. One of these was the George Medal awarded by the British government on behalf of the grateful British Empire, including New Zealand. At that time, all countries in the British Empire were part of the British honours system, the rules of which do not allow for a period of service or acts of bravery to be recognised more than once. It was not possible, therefore, for New Zealand or Australia, of which Nancy Wake was also a citizen, to recognise her deeds during World War II with separate awards for bravery. And that was the advice that was supplied to the previous government as well.
Standard & Poor's is saying we're facing an export-driven slowdown due to slowdowns in the EU and the US. Is it fair to say now that Treasury's growth forecasts in the budget were perhaps a bit too optimistic?
Not in the slightest. I think we live in a global environment. What happens around the world obviously has an impact on New Zealand. We're seeing that today with the stock market 2.5% lower and the exchange rate a little bit lower. But I mean, overall, Treasury's growth forecast was somewhere in the middle of the pack. There's a number of factors that will help New Zealand out when it comes to growth, not least of them being the Christchurch rebuild and obviously a situation with the Rugby World Cup in a short-term basis. I mean, if the world slows down as a result of the credit downgrade, then obviously that is likely to have some impact on New Zealand. We're not immune from that. But one of the factors that does help is if you do see that slowdown, you'll likely see some pullback in commodity prices, potentially a lower exchange rate. So I'm reasonably confident we'll get that forecast.
S&P also say that they would expect if there's some slowdown similar to or worse than 2008, that the governments in the Asia Pacific region would use their balance sheets to effectively stimulate the economy.
Yeah.
Is that your view of the way your government would behave?
Well, I think we took the right course of action. If you go back to 2009, there was a lot of pressure on us from a number of quarters for us to do more and to spend more. And we resisted that because we believed that the policies we'd campaigned on and were then implementing were stimulatory, and I think that was the right course of action to follow. My view is that we always assess the situation as and when it's required, but I'm very committed to wanting to keep our debt levels below 30% of GDP if possible. We've got the Christchurch earthquake to contend with. Most economic commentators, including the Reserve Bank and the Treasury, are of the view that we are seeing strengthening of our economy and our labour markets, and so at this point I think we should follow the track that we're on, and I wouldn't be looking to have extra stimulation.
Because there's a tension there, isn't there, between what you and the Finance Minister are saying, controlling spending and lowering debt, and S&P's view of if things turn ugly, you'll need to actually reverse that and effectively borrow and spend.
Yeah, I think one thing that gives us an advantage over a lot of other countries, we still have room in terms of monetary policy. Interest rates are 2.5% in New Zealand. Most of these countries you talk about have interest rates that are zero. So there's some room there if it was all required from the Reserve Bank. I think secondly, our exchange rate, because it is high, particularly against the US dollar, again gives us some flexibility, and there could be some correction there. So look, the government is following, I think, a credible, sensible path to get us back into surplus and to protect New Zealanders. I think that's the right course of action. And we'll continue to monitor what happens around the world. But I'm comfortable we're on the right path.
The last point of the S&P advisory today was that they believed that if there were another downturn, it would be deeper and more prolonged than 2008. Is that your view?
I'm a bit more optimistic than that, to be perfectly honest. I think if you have a look at what's happening around the world, firstly, back in 2008, 2009, the banking system was extremely stressed. Now, that situation is for the most part in better shape. So you've seen a lot of bad loans being written off around the world, in certain places recapitalisation of the banking system. Secondly, no question that corporate balance sheets are a lot stronger. I mean, Apple has $85 billion in cash on their own, let alone a lot of other companies. And in New Zealand, corporate balance sheets are very strong, as they are in Australia. So I think that's good. Thirdly, there's been an adjustment in terms of the labour markets. Tragically, people have lost their jobs, but that's put companies in a leaner position than they were. From the government's point of view, we front-end loaded a lot of our borrowing requirements, so we're well and truly cashed up in terms of our borrowing requirements, and we borrowed that money at very, very efficient yields, so we're paying quite low interest rates for that cash. So I personally think the world's in a lot better shape to cope with this. I think what you're seeing is, and you're also seeing European central banks today coming out saying that they may take some action. So it's one of the reasons why the markets aren't down, in a major way today. You've got Korea down about 4%, us down about 2.5%, Australia down about 2% in terms of the stock exchange, but they're not dramatic moves. And I think that's partially because the ECBs have indicated they might buy European sovereign debt if it's required. So personally, I don't think this is going to be as bad as what we saw in 2008, 2009.
Do you expect KiwiSaver accounts to have had a bit of a hit over the last few days of the week?
They will. I mean, KiwiSaver accounts will take loss the last few days, as would have the New Zealand Super Fund and ACC. But I think it's worth remembering, I mean, equity markets have had a big move up in the last 6 to 12 months. The thing with a KiwiSaver account or New Zealand Super Fund is you invest for the medium to long term. There'll always be some fluctuations, but overall, I think equity markets are performing reasonably well.
You're basing your views on an export-led recovery, though, and isn't it a bit dangerous to say that outlook is still as rosy as it was before, when you've got the US and EU slowing down, and China and Australia won't be able to hold their rates of growth if the rest of the world around them is slowing down?
I think it's a slightly different situation in the US. I mean, non-farm payroll numbers weren't too bad on Friday. I mean, overall, look, I think what you've got is just a situation where Standard & Poor's is telling the United States it needs to take its medicine. And we were of the same view back in 2010, 2011. We put together our budgets that we had to take a responsible view and keep an eye to what the rating agencies were saying. If we didn't do that, we'd be downgraded. And I think that's the challenge, is how efficiently the US can work through an environment where it has less spending. But I think it's a little bit too early to make predictions of exactly what that means. You've still got a strong Asian market. So it'll have some impact, but I personally I'm less pessimistic than say I was back in 2008.
What do you think all this uncertainty and volatility will do for the chances of mum and dad investors wanting to invest in state assets to float on the share market?
Well, it's some way off. I mean, first we've got to win an election, and then we've got to mobilise that policy. But overall, if you look at the very long-run history of the bond markets versus the equity markets, the long-run return of equity markets is a margin above the bond markets. So if you invest in equities for a long period of time, history tells you make more money than invest in bond markets. And I think these are very strong assets that New Zealanders will want to own. So I don't think there'll be any question there'll be a very strong appetite for shares in SOEs if we're in a position to be able to roll out that policy.
If the markets haven't settled down, would you hold off, presuming you're re-elected, would you hold off those sales rather than risk them going too cheaply?
Yeah, so obviously you assess that on a case-by-case basis, and whether you're a public entity or a private sector company looking to go to the equity markets, you always have to have a mind for what's happening. But we've got time on our side, and what's happening today isn't necessarily going to be what the position's going to look like in 12, 18 months' time.
So what does that mean for your debt reduction plans if the floating of the state assets could be, the timing could be doubtful?
Well, you're talking about potential timing implications of something in the order of months. If you go and have a look at Labour's plan, they are saying by their own numbers, forget about our analysis of it, which will be a lot more robust than theirs, but even by their own numbers, they're going to run more debt than us for the next decade. It's much more worrying, I would have thought, to the rating agencies.
But you're counting on $7 billion from these asset sales. That figure could end up being nothing like that.
I don't think that's good analysis, actually.
I
I really don't. I mean, it's pretty lame to sort of make the case that if there's going to be, a slight volatility in the markets, that all of a sudden you're never going to get $7 billion. I mean, the history of IPOs shows you that sometimes, markets, people, products don't go to market or a company doesn't go to market, but it's usually a timing differential of a few months, maybe 6 months.
One of the arguments for New Zealand being such a good bet is that we've got low public sector debt. But Standard & Poor's and the other ratings agencies are increasingly lumping private sector debt into there. Is there more we can do or should be doing on getting New Zealand's private sector debt down, or are you comfortable with what's happening at the moment?
We take on board seriously the issues of Standard & Poor's view that our net external liabilities are high, and that includes both public and private sector debt. That's why we made the changes in budget 2010 and 2011. In particular, raising consumption taxes and dropping personal taxes, dropping the taxes on savings, trying to get rid of the anomalies in the system, taking $1 billion out of the property market effectively. All of those things were all attempts to lift national savings, as is the potential case that we're looking at, whether we have auto-enrolment for people that aren't in KiwiSaver but are currently in the workforce. They're all actions aimed at trying to lift national savings.
But given the current market turmoil and the fact that our banks still borrow about 35% of their funds offshore in those hot money markets, should there be more done to get them to try and focus on domestic funding rather than international?
Yes, but I think if you look at how you can increase national savings, which is the basic argument, you ultimately have to go back and say, how do we do that? And that is, New Zealanders generally need to be wealthier. That gives them great opportunities to save, and they have to have opportunities to save. That's one of the arguments around mixed ownership model, is about extension of the assets available for New Zealanders to invest in.